To our evening session of the VID21 conference. My name is Julia Steele, the creator and host. If this is your first session to VID, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. You are in for an absolute treat as we have one of my great friends, Oscar Trimboli, expert in all things listening and more importantly, deep listening. Oscar is on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. He is the author, host of the Apple Award-winning podcast Deep Listening, and a sought-after keynote speaker. He's passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in homes, workplaces, and the world. And through his work with chairs, boards of directors, executive teams in local, regional, and global organizations, Oscar has experienced firsthand the transformational effect leaders and organizations can have when they listen beyond the words. So, Oscar, welcome. So great to have you here. I know already that the room is filling up with people that are eager to listen. So why don't we get on and explore what that means and what deep listening really means.
Thanks, Julia. I'm looking forward to listening to everybody's questions as well. Most of us aren't even aware that starting by focusing on the speaker is the wrong place to start. Focusing on the speaker is the wrong place to start. You're listening, and this is one of the myths of listening I want to bust for you today when it comes to your listening. For many of us, we're not even aware of the cost of not listening in our own workplace. And for many of us, we get really, really frustrated when people aren't listening to us. So I'd be curious, in the chat window right now, I'd love you to pop in the answer to this question. What's the other person doing when they're not listening to you? What's the other person not doing when they're not listening to you? So pop that in the chat box. What's the other person doing or not doing when they're not listening to you? And be warned, today's going to be really interactive. I'm going to be listening to you, but I'm also wanting to create a listening culture and environment that you can role model back into the organizations that you're part of. My job is not only for you to listen to me, but to create connections across everybody who's listening live and on the recording as well. So in the chat window, let's pop down. What's the other person doing when they're not listening to you? Thank you for everybody who's engaging here. They're not giving you respect. There's a really common one. The most common one is number 2. They're looking at their phone. They're not listening. And they're daydreaming. They're doing other things. They're trying to multitask, or they're just zoning out and they're just staring at you. And sometimes that staring is good or not. Are they hearing you or are they understanding you? Good point from Marie there when it comes there. And they could be simply, as Julia says, they could be wondering what they're having for lunch. Today, we're lucky I'm pinned in the chat and I'm pinned in the video as well. And there's a spotlight on. When you're listening in video conferencing, this is not the way to do it. Unless you're the host of the meeting, you should not be listening in gallery view. You should be listening in speaker only view. So whether you're using Zoom or Teams or Google Hangouts or anything else, make sure you pin the active speaker in the conversation. This will help you double your listening productivity, and you'll move from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. Very clear, easy to focus on, and limited distractions. For bonus points today, we're giving away 3 prizes for the most curious questions when it comes to listening. There is a 4th prize. The 4th prize is this. If you can tell me the color of my eyes, when you get a bit bored, when you get a bit distracted, just focus on the color of the speaker's eyes. There's a really great hack when it comes to listening on a video conference. Too many of us zone out. We literally get fatigued from a visual perspective. One of the things I'll be doing today is inviting you to actually switch the vision off and give your eyes a rest and listen in audio only mode. Now, for those people who want to guess the color of my eyes, a lot of jokers often say, Oscar, is bloodshot eyes a correct answer? That is the color of the whites of my eyes. It is not the color of my eyes. It's interesting though, my eye color changes during the day. So when it comes to noticing my eye color, use that as a little hack for when it comes to basically taking the time to not be distracted. Let me introduce you to someone you won't know, Dr. Wei-Ling Lee. Dr. Wei-Ling Lee is a basketball-loving ophthalmologist. And on December 30, 2019, he sent a message on WeChat to his 5 basketball buddies and said, look after your parents and look after your grandparents. What he actually wrote was, look after your elders on the keypad. Because what he discovered was the elders in the hospital he was treating were dying of a respiratory condition very similar to SARS. 4 days later, Dr. Wei-Ling Lee received a knock on the door from the Wuhan police telling him to remove his post from WeChat. They said, you can't be right, remove what you've written there, it's not correct. And for the next 3 days, Dr. Lee wrestled with his conscience. And in wrestling with his conscience in those 3 days while treating the patients, he himself contracted coronavirus and later, 4 days later, went on to pass away from the coronavirus. Now, before you're too quick to judge the Chinese authorities, what we're seeing here is a great example of people not being listened to because they have different opinions, they come from a different profession, they come from a different perspective to the mainstream dogma. So when it comes to listening in your workplace, be careful about who you choose to listen to, and maybe you're not even conscious of the people you choose to ignore. Jackson Hole, Wyoming is a place in the United States which is renowned for its fly fishing, of all things, but it's also where central bankers meet once a year. They meet in August, and they meet on the 2nd week of August. And you're looking at Dr. Rajan Raghu. Dr. Rajan Raghu loves Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings. He's a vegetarian and he's trained as an electrical engineer. But in 2005, he did a presentation to all the central bankers of the world, and they all laughed at him. They all said he was wrong, and they almost laughed him off the stage. Now, the good news is Dr. Rajan Raghu's paper was published at that time. And what he said was that the global financial plumbing system is backed up like a block sewage systems, and the pipes are about to explode. Central banks ignored him, and the cost of not listening to a different opinion is counted in the billions of dollars. It's counted in unemployment, and it completely changed the political system for the next 2 decades. At exactly the same time, a medical doctor, Dr. Michael Burry in California, was doing similar calculations to Dr. Raghu, who was doing calculations on the East Coast, came to exactly the same conclusion. In fact, they made a movie about Dr. Michael Burry called The Big Short, which is a movie that explains why Wall Street didn't listen and why he went on to make an absolute fortune. For many of us, we're not even conscious of the cost of not listening because we don't know how to listen well. We've been taught maths, we've been taught science, we may have been taught history, but we haven't been taught how to listen. Right now, you're not even sure why you're distracted. You could be giving me attention right now, or you could be paying attention right now. Some of us don't even know where our attention is. Paying attention feels like, oh, it's a duty, it's taxation, it's something that I have to do. Giving attention is an act of generosity, it's an act of curiosity, it's an act that makes a big difference. So I'm curious right now, in the chat window, are you giving attention or are you paying attention? I'll be curious to listen for your response. Are you giving attention or are you paying attention? the good news is neither is right or wrong. It's what is appropriate. So you could be doing both. If you take off in an airplane and you're a regular traveler, when you hear the flight safety announcement, you're probably paying attention. You probably feel like you have to do it. Oh, you might take your book down, or you might take your device down, and you might pay attention. But I can guarantee you one thing: if you are flying and there is turbulence and the oxygen masks come down and the flight attendants have to do the flight safety briefing, you will be giving your complete and undivided attention to whoever's speaking in the moment. So in the chat box, we've got a range of things when it comes to giving and paying attention. I want you to become conscious. Neither is right or wrong. Some parts of the presentation today, you'll be giving me attention. Some parts you'll be paying attention. Great, flexible, comfortable and nuanced listeners choose what the group needs or what the other person needs in the moment. When you're listening to heavily emotionally laden content, you probably want to be giving attention. If you're having a Six Sigma quality control meeting, you probably want to be paying attention in those conversations as well. And sometimes you need to be able to flex into both and keep in mind what's going on in that moment. Should I be giving attention or should I be paying attention? Now, as we go along, please feel free. If you've got a question that you want to ask, I'm always going to be watching the chat window. So sometimes I'll pause, check the questions, and if it's appropriate, I'll answer them. And if not, I'll make a note and I'll bring them back to you later on as well. So don't feel bound by time about when you want to ask any kinds of questions. The reason it's important is your fellow participants are going to see the questions as well, and they might add on to the question. Bear in mind, if we all listen to each other, we are all going to listen a lot better together. When we think about the cost of not listening, sometimes it's measured in a completely different way. Sometimes it's measured this way. This is April 2014. What you're seeing here is the deep water oil rig. It's called Deepwater Horizons. It's run by BP and it has just exploded. The cost of this for BP is still being counted today, $53 billion. Let me say that again, $53 billion. The cost is extraordinary for BP, and the backstory is very simple. The engineers were bringing back the Deepwater Oil Horizon out of planned maintenance and were following a set of procedures, a standard operating procedure that had listed out the speed at which the oil rig could come back. Management, in their wisdom, wanted the oil rig back online faster, and an argument ensued between the engineering staff, the production workers, and the management. The management basically said, bring it online faster, bring it online sooner, and move to full production as quickly as possible. And despite the fact that the engineering and production staff not only said that this is going to be dangerous, the consequences will be felt for decades to come. 53 billion sounds like a huge number. The number that matters right now for the Deepwater Oil Horizon is 11. 11 people lost their lives on the oil rig. 11 souls were lost because management wouldn't listen to the standard operating procedures that they created. Now, before you're too quick to judge the people on the Deepwater Oil Horizon, think about who you're not listening to in your workplace. Are you doing it consciously or unconsciously? Who are the people you're giving attention to, and who are the people you are paying your attention to? Too many times, it's the people that are closest to our customers, our stakeholders, our voters, our regulators, that are the ones that go unnoticed and ignored. How good are you setting up psychological safety for those inside your organization? Now, I'm going to admit, everything is awesome when you're part of a team. And that's not what I'm saying. It's what the team at Lego say. Lego, or Legot, as you would say in Danish, means to play well together. And Lego, formed in the early 1900s, Lego created wooden ducks on a string with 4 wheels. That was the early days of Lego. And Lego created a huge organization in Denmark around the factory that built these wooden ducks. The factory burnt down in the 1920s. And rather than reimagine what's possible, Lego continued on, rebuilt the factory, and then in the war in the 1940s, all the wood in Denmark had to go for the war effort, and Lego had to reinvent itself. This time, they invented what you know today as the Lego system, that series of plastic bricks that hold together. Lego in the 30s, in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s was one of the most popular toys in the world, and in the 1990s, they were making so much money, they decided to build Lego theme parks that nearly sent Lego broke. So broke, in fact, that they had to bring in a non-family member to run the Lego enterprise. As a result, the new CEO said, I wonder if we could make Lego movies. Now, if you've ever seen the very first Lego movie, you would be a rare and deep adult fan of Lego. The very first adult Lego movie lost $2.5 million. And as a result, the CEO decided he better listen to somebody else. He'd listen to some movie makers. Lord and Miller from Hollywood were recruited over to Denmark, and they asked for complete creative control. When they did, the CEO said, you've got complete creative control if you spend the next 3 months touring the world and listening to adult fans of Lego. Now, I didn't know this, but in Lego lands, adult fans of Lego using glue is not good. In fact, they give it a name, and it became a subplot for the movie. The Kegel was part of the subplot. And because the adult fans of Lego picked up the second movie and started talking about it to everybody in their communities, Lego movies became a billion-dollar franchise for Lego and created another billion-dollar franchise, Lego computer games, as a result. I'm curious, in your workplace, are you listening to superfans as employees? Are you listening to superfans who are customers? Are you listening to super advocates out there? Because if you listen carefully, they're going to give you the very, very detailed information that could change your idea from basic to a billion-dollar idea. So when it comes to listening in your organization, I'm curious, what is the cost of not listening in your workplace? In your workplace, please pop in the chat. What's the cost of not listening in your workplace? Pop it in the chat. What's the cost of not listening? Thanks, Hassan. You've got there that it creates chaos. Low retention of staff, unhappy clients, lost customers, lost sales, mistakes, becoming out of touch. These are really good examples of the cost of not listening. Let's continue that theme though. When it comes to your workplace, who are you not listening to in your workplace? Who are you not listening to in your workplace? I'd be curious to see what you put in the chat with regard to that. Who are you not listening to? A great insight here from Pip McDonald. She says, not listening to the introverts. Good insight, where Fiona says we're not listening to our customers. And Sarah says she's not listening to herself. It's a good point, Sarah. We're going to come back to the point about listening to yourself, not listening to contractors. I think there's a bias towards positive feedback. Interesting reflection there. So is that a reflection on the way I'm providing feedback, Marie, or is that a reflection of your workplace? I'd be curious if you'd like to make a distinction there for me. People who are low in the hierarchy, that's probably one of the most common reflections I get there as well. It's also people who don't want to take risks. We're not listening to those people. Yeah. So Marie clarifies here and says, it's about the workplace, Oscar. People always want to hear the good. By the way, when it comes to feedback, I think it's interesting. Feed forward, that's more interesting. Feedback tells you what's happened. Feed forward tells you about what you can change in the future. Sometimes the act of only telling management what they want to hear creates systems that become impervious to external complaints. And in Australia, as a result, we get royal commissions, commissions of inquiries, and as a result, the complaints already existed in the systems that are there. So if you're wondering what gets in your way when it comes to listening, you can just go and visit listeningquiz.com. It's 7 minutes. You can take the quiz. You'll get a 5-page report tailored exactly to tell you what the kind of listening villain you are and give you 3 simple steps to overcome that as well. So here's a dirty little secret of listening. It's very common for people to say listening starts by focusing on the speaker. It's not the place to start. Where you start your listening is with you. The first person you need to listen to is yourself. Sarah, well done for listening to yourself. But too many of us have all these browser tabs going on in our mind. We don't know what's going on with the speaker because we're in a dialogue with ourselves, and the dialogue is about, what should I have for dinner? What could I have had differently for lunch? I need a coffee. The speaker's speaking too slow. The speaker's speaking too fast. I need to sort something out on the weekend. Oh my God, can this guy get on with it because I'm waiting for dinner? I'm going to explain the neuroscience of what's going on in your mind shortly, but too many of us think that by focusing on the speaker is the right place to start. We want to start by focusing on you. Right now, in this moment, how many browser tabs do you have open in your own mind? How many browser tabs have you got open? In the chat, just give me a number. Have you got 5, 15, 50, too many to count? Apparently the answer, if you're using Chrome, is $4.99. I did this presentation to a team at Google and the Chrome product manager said, Oscar, by the way, the maximum number of browser tabs you can have open in a browser as opposed to your own mind is $4.99. For many of us, it ranges between single digits and double digits. And all the things that are going on in your mind right now are what's getting in the way of you listening to somebody else. So in the chat, we've got a range from 0, I don't buy it, Julia, I don't buy what you're selling. There are no 0 browser tabs going on in your mind. I'm not talking about your actual browser tabs on your computer, Julia. I'm talking about all the browser tabs open in your mind. See, listening happens in the modern part of the brain, and too many of us are triggered by the primitive part of the brain because we don't realize what's going on. So here's 3 quick tips when it comes to practicing listening to yourself. Tip number 1, switch off your notifications. And for a lot of you, you think, oh, it's this crazy man talking about switch off my notifications. I'm super duper important. Unless you're running a production line or you're a healthcare worker that needs real-time information, you're probably not that important. Just switch your notifications to silent if you just felt like I was a drug dealer who took away your drugs. Those red dots and notifications on your mobile phone, on your cell phone, on your handy, they were all designed by the same people who designed slot machines or poker machines, not only to grab your attention, but to hold your attention so you would endlessly, 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 endlessly scroll. So use the technology, don't let the technology use you. If you use a Mac or a PC, there's one button. If you use an iPad or an Android, there's one button that you can move your notifications off. In fact, on a Mac, you have an extra button that says you can switch off your notifications when you're in a meeting. So you don't have to worry about switching your notifications back on. So tip number 1, switch your notifications on. We've got 7,500 listeners in our listening database. We're tracking 1,400 of them. And they say the biggest tip that made the biggest difference to their listening is switching their notifications off. It's really easy to say, it's hard to do. It's hard to practice and it's hard to make a habit of. But if you start and with some encouragement, you can get there. One of the things we don't realize about our listening is that we were born listeners. In fact, we were conceived listeners. At 20 weeks inside your mother's womb, you could distinguish your mother's voice from any other sound. At 34 weeks, you could distinguish Beethoven from Bon Jovi from Beaver. You could listen to music. And then the very act of being born, you come into the world screaming. And that first scream you make, here's a bit of trivia, when you scream, that's the time they note on the birth certificate, and that's when you're actually born. And for the rest of our lives, most people think the only way to communicate is by speaking. Communication is 50% listening and 50% speaking. So when it comes to listening, it's really important that you know that tip number 1 is switch off your notifications. Now, tip number 2 is even simpler. It's about the 30-minute mark in this conversation. So let's drink a glass of water. And if you drink water during your team meetings, the rest of your team will have water as well. For some of you, you're watching this right now and you're going to go and grab some water. Why is water important when it comes to listening? A hydrated brain is a listening brain. Listening happens in the modern part of the brain, and the brain is only 5% of body mass, but it consumes 26% of blood sugar. The fastest way to get blood sugars to the brain is make sure it's hydrated. So tip number 2, drink water. And tip number 1, switch off the notifications. And tip number 3, it's so simple. I'm going to do it. I'll be curious if you even notice me doing it. Here we go. Tip number 3. Tip number 3 is 3 deep breaths. The deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. An oxygenated brain is a listening brain. And it's critical for all of us when it comes to our listening to make sure that we're hydrated and we take a deep breath. And these deep breaths are sending a signal to a part of the body called the parasympathetic nervous system that says, everything's okay. We don't have to react to what they said. We can just stay in the moment. So when it comes to listening, it starts with you. You are the starting point of listening. Today, we're going to explore the 5 levels of listening, and we've just explored level 1, listening to yourself. Level 2 is listening to their content. That's what they say, what you see, and what you sense. Too many of us are stuck. We're caught up in our own selves when it comes to listening. And we can't even access level 2. Level 2 is quite foundational when it comes to listening. Level 2 is about listening to the content. Now, we have a lot to thank the ancients when it comes to listening, whether that's the Australian Aborigines, whether that's the Inuit of North America, whether it's the jungle tribes of South America, the desert tribes of North Asia, the high context cultures of the East, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans. I want to introduce you to the Mandarin. I want to introduce you to Ting. Ting means to listen. It's a very active phrase. Now, apologies to people from a Mandarin culture. You would never deconstruct this character. This character is unified, but Ting decomposed for the way the West likes to learn is broken down into 6 elements. 6 elements of listening. Now, in the 12th century, Ting was taught to emperors in waiting. How did they listen to their armies? How do they listen to the people in the empire around them? When it comes to your listening, for the rest of this conversation, which one of the 6 elements of Ting will you focus on when it comes to your listening? Pop it in the chat. Which one of the 6 will you focus on for the balance of the listening? So we commonly get 2 that show up in the top 80%. And again, we're seeing the 2 show up in the top 80% here. Focus and presence. That's not to say the others aren't important, but focus and presence are the most foundational elements of Ting. We've gone back to the 12th century. I'd like to introduce you to the neuroscience of listening. When it comes to listening, I'd like to introduce you to the 125-400 rule, which is the reason you're distracted. It basically says that I speak 4 times slower than you can listen. When it comes to listening, I speak way too slow for you. But if I start to speed up, if I start to speak at about 200 words per minute, if I speak like a horse race caller or a cattle yard auctioneer or a real estate agent, you can still completely comprehend everything that I'm saying. The 125-400 rule says I speak at 1/4 of your listening speed and you can listen 4 times faster. We know that blind people can listen at up to 3 times speed and have complete comprehension because they're not distracted by the visual elements of listening. So I'm curious, when you think about the 125-400 rule, do you notice your visual distractions? We're about to do an exercise and I need to explain the exercise so that you understand it's an exercise of 2 parts. The first part of this exercise, I would encourage you to listen with your eyes closed because you'll be listening to audio only. I'd like you to notice what's happening with your listening while that's going on. The next part of this exercise, we will listen to the audio and the video simultaneously. Now, I need to explain that this is a conversation in a workplace between an air traffic controller and a pilot. The pilot is Captain Sullenberg. He is flying an A380 Airbus with his co-pilot. They are taking off from LaGuardia Airport in New York and they're about to turn and bank left and go south to Charlotte, North Carolina. Something happens on the way. The plane strikes a group of geese on both engines, on both sides of the plane. They call them birds in the audio. The plane lands on the Hudson River and everybody is safe. There's been a movie made of Captain Sullenberger and Tom Hanks, in fact, plays Captain Sullenberger. So I would encourage you, I'm going to count you in, to close your eyes and listen to this next 100 seconds of audio with your eyes closed and notice what's going on for you. Bear with me. I'll count you in. In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Cactus 15.9, turn left heading 270.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds to lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures. Got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines. He said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land 1013?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
Showing 2760. Turn left 070.
070, showing 2760.
Hi, Cactus 15.9. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Cactus 15.9. Runway 4 is available if you want to make left traffic to runway 4.
I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey? Maybe Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off your right side is Teterboro Airport. Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire. Actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, guys.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge. Wants to go to the airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
It's that last 10 seconds at the end where it blanks out that you think a little bit differently. Please, in the chat, what did you notice about your listening when you were listening with your eyes closed in audio only mode? What did you notice about your listening? Please pop it in the chat. Now, there is a number of numbers that fly around. The flight, unfortunately, is called, abbreviated to cactus. In Australia, that means something very different. And they call a number of flight numbers. They don't actually keep the same flight number. I'd like you, when you're listening next, to listen for the flight numbers and listen for the question that completely changes the pilot's response. Now, most people, when they hear in audio only, because they don't have the context, they spend the first 15 seconds just calibrating their listening to the accents and the jargon. I wonder what accents I'd hear in your workplace and what kind of jargon I'd hear. Are you being inclusive and helping people land with that jargon or not? I'm loving the reflections here in the chat. It's a lot easier to understand when it's on because I'm creating pictures in my own mind. It helps me focus on the replies. The details were more obvious. I became accustomed to the accents and sounds much more quickly. So what I'd love you to do now is make sure you notice the difference, because we're going to play this exact same audio with captioning, and I'd like you to watch it and I'd like you to notice what's different when it comes to your listening. Again, I'll count you in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Cactus 15.9, turn left heading 270.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds to lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop you to park. He's got emergency returning. Who is it? It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529, which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines, he said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land 1013?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
Showing 2760, turn left 070.
070, showing 2760.
Hi, Cactus 15.9. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Cactus 15.9. Runway 4 is available if you want to make left traffic to runway 4.
Idiot. I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey? Maybe Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off your right side is Teterboro Airport. Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire. Actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, guys.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge. Wants to go to the airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
How did you go this time? What did you notice about your listening while you were listening with your eyes? Fiona said, I was really just reading instead of listening. Thank you. Anything else, Fiona? I'm curious. Anything else, Julia? I'm curious. Sarah says, I didn't take in the information as well. I think it helped to hear more of the conversation, says Marie. I picked up a lot more, says Fiona. You see, one thing we're not even conscious about when it comes to our own listening is that some of us listen auditory and some of us listen visually. Some of us prefer to process and store information visually, and some are happy doing it audio. Hopefully by doing this exercise, you'll realize what that means for you. But more importantly, what does it mean for somebody else you're talking to as well? If somebody loves to grab a whiteboard marker, loves a PowerPoint slide, loves to talk in stories and diagrams, probably processing in a very visual way. And for people who are reflective, careful, thoughtful, deliberate, Maybe some people might call them introverts. They may be processing auditory. There is no correlation between introversion and auditory processing. But to one of the points that was made earlier on, how do you listen to introverts? It's not by cold calling them in meetings and saying, what do you think? The best way to get an introvert to speak up is to ask them to make a reflection by themselves, share it with one other person, and then they'll feel safe enough to share it with the group. One of the things we don't notice is whether we listen for similarities or whether we listen for differences. As you're looking at what everybody's putting in the chat box, do you notice whether you're listening for similarities or maybe you're exploring what's different? In the chat, just put a D for differences or an S for similarities. What's your primary listening orientation? In organizations that profess to have strong cultures, but in fact what they have is cults, they only listen for similarities, and in fact they chew up and spit out anybody who thinks and speaks up differently. Strong cultures are inclusive and weak cultures are exclusive when it comes to listening. Again, when it comes to listening, neither is right or wrong. It's whether it's appropriate, and skillful leaders will understand how to listen for both contexts, not just for listening for similarities or differences. What they're looking for consistently is both. Skillful leaders listen for similarities and differences. Well, what I'm noticing in here, it's fairly evenly balanced. People are saying similarities and differences. And some people are saying, well, Oscar, it just depends on the situation. So just notice while you were reading, because reading and listening are very closely correlated in the brain. Which comments were you drawn to? Were you drawn to the comments that were similar to the way you were processing your listening? Or were you drawn to the differences? That's a good way to think about that. In 2010, my daughter-in-law, Jen, was riding a bike, and Jen is a judo player. Judo players have a unique relationship with pain. They literally can pass out before they will submit on a judo mat. Jen was an elite judo player back then, and on her 21st birthday, she was very excited. She got a bike, and rather than jog to the dojo, which was 3 kilometers away, she was able to get on her push bike and ride to the dojo. But in the second week of her bike and her riding her bike, she was hit by a car. It completely smashed her ankle. Because she had this unique relationship with pain, Jen knew that she had to pick up her bike, put it on her shoulder, and she knew that only 750 meters away was a medical center. When she arrived at the medical center, the receptionist ushered her straight in to see the doctor. The bike was left in reception in a very mangled state. The doctor asked Jen to sit down, and the doctor started to go through a series of questions and diagnosis. What I'd love you to do in the chat window right now is describe the nationality of the doctor, the gender of the doctor, the height of the doctor, and any other characteristics in your mind's eye while you were listening to this story about Jen walking into the doctor's surgery. Please, in the chat box, describe the doctor. So we've got a male doctor who's Indian and older. We've got an older Asian female with glasses and a white coat. And most of us will have the image of the doctor informed by movies or our own personal experience. The doctor was a bit surprised about how Jen made it to the clinic. Thanks for that comment, Nosh, but the instruction was to describe the doctor rather than the doctor's surprise. I appreciate you taking the story a bit further. The doctor was a male, they were tall, and they were oblivious to the immediate pain levels. They were process orientated, middle-aged and white. Thanks everybody for sharing the story. Here's what really happened. Jen was in Mumbai, and Jen was treated by a 32-year-old, 5'4" Indian lady doctor. Now, for many of us, our listening biases have become very evident because the doctor we were listening for is a doctor we know, or a doctor we might have watched on a TV show or on a movie. I wonder what's getting in your way when it comes to your listening. It could be the fact that you're listening too much to the content and not enough for listening for the context. The context of any conversation is about the backstory. The context is really simple. A quiz show contestant has been arrested by the police. That's one way to describe a movie. Or I could describe the movie as Jamal Malik is a 5-year-old boy when his mother is killed in a street riot in the slums of Mumbai. He learns to work with a group of pickpockets and beggars and eventually gets a job in a call center where he learns a whole bunch of trivia. His trivia sets him up to be the perfect candidate for a show called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? But unfortunately, he's too good. The police suspect he's cheating and call him in to be investigated. That movie, of course, is the Oscar award-winning movie Slumdog Millionaire. But most conversations that we have with people, we just listen to quiz show contestant arrested by the police and we continue the story rather than simply asking the question, could you take me back to the beginning? Could you tell me when this first started? And in doing so, you're asking that question not for you, but for them. Here's another dirty little secret of listening. It's not your job to make sense of what they say. It's your job to help them make sense of what they think. And the first step in that journey is listening for the context. It's listening for the backstory. When we listen for the context in the backstory, then we can move a little bit further and start to notice their language patterns. Do they speak in the future? Do they speak in the past? Do they speak about details or do they speak about stories? Do they speak about themselves or do they speak about the collective? Once you start to notice language patterns, you can ask them to notice the language patterns themselves. It's not your job to notice and label their patterns. Your job is to simply ask this question. I'm curious if you've noticed any patterns in this story. Quite often, it's a moment of reflection. Too many of us listen for symptoms and we don't listen for what is happening in the system itself. Systemic listening will create an impact beyond words, but listening to symptoms, the very first thing that people say is really not a good use of your time. Level 4 is listening for what's unsaid, and Yoda would say, listen for what's unsaid. And I'd say back to Yoda, hey Yoda, I'm struggling just to listen to what people are saying. How can I listen to what they're not saying? Then Yoda would go on to explain to us this simple rule, the 125-900 rule. You speak at 125 words per minute, yet you can think it up to 900 words per minute. If you're dealing with collaborative, creative, competitive, or constrained situations, you're probably thinking it up to 1600 words per minute. Here's a bit of maths and neuroscience when it comes to the speaker. If you're just listening to the first thing they say, you are listening to 11% of what they're thinking, 11%. And if they're dealing with constrained, collaborative, conflict-based, creative situations, you're probably only listening to 5% because they're thinking at 1600 words per minute. Stop listening to the first thing they say. Start to listen to what they're thinking. So I want to provide 3 quick tips for you. It's brought to you by Yoda, and Yoda would give us these 3 tips. Tip number 1, tell me more. If you can say, tell me more, I guarantee you what they'll do is they'll take a deep breath in, they'll reach out and sigh and they go, well, actually, and they will use the word actually. They go, actually, what I should be talking about is this. Or they go, actually, what's really important is this. Tip number 1, tell me more. Tip number 2, and what else? Easy way to remember this, AWE, or the or question, and what else? Again, it helps them unpick their thinking and gets them thinking about the 125-900 rule a little bit deeper and get into their thinking. Tip number 3 is so powerful, you need to be careful with it. Done well, it can have an impact beyond words. get done poorly, it can feel threatening, it can feel confrontational. Tip number 3 is this. Tip number 3, don't worry, the camera didn't freeze, is to pause. Now, it's no coincidence that the word silence and the word listen have exactly the same letters. So tip number 1, tell me more. Tip number 2, and what else? And tip number 3 is simply to pause. We do this really well in the East and ancient cultures, yet in the West we say it's the pregnant pause, it's the awkward silence, it's the deafening silence. It's not that bad. In high context cultures, silence is a sign of wisdom, it's a sign of respect, it's a sign of authority. Now, when it comes to listening, what we want to ultimately do is listen at level 5. Level 5 is listening for their meaning. At level 5, we're having an impact. And what I said earlier on, it's not your job to understand what they say, it's your job to help them make sense of what they're thinking. I'm reminded of this story where Christopher, a 6-year-old boy, comes home from kindergarten and he says to his mum, Jennifer, Mummy, today I learnt about maths and I learnt about division. And today I learnt that 3 is half of 8. Jen slaps her head in her forehead and goes, what are they teaching these kids at school today? She said, Christopher, come and sit on the kitchen table. She goes to the cupboard, she grabs some M&Ms, 8 M&Ms, and lays them out 4 and 4 on the table and says, Christopher, here are 4 M&Ms, here are 4 M&Ms. This adds up to 8. 4 is half of 8. And Christopher enthusiastically jumps off the chair and says, 3 is half of 8, 3 is half of 8, 3 is half of 8, and goes and grabs a piece of paper and says, Mummy, look, I'll show you. He drew the figure 8 on a piece of paper. He folds it in half. And then he folds it in half again. And then he takes the 8, he tears it in half and shows his mum. 3 is in fact half of 8. Too many of us are in the workplace convinced that we know that the answer is 4 and there's a possibility that the answer could be 3. That in fact 3 is half of 8 as well as 4 being half of 8. What I'm most curious about today is I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. And what I'm curious is, what's the one thing, the absolute one thing you're going to apply from what we've discussed today and pop it in the chat, not only for you, but for everybody else who's reading the chat. What's the one thing you'll apply from today when it comes to your listening? By the way, if you're going to apply more than one thing, please include that in the chat as well. We want to help everybody listen to each other, not just to me. I'm Oscar Trimboli. I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, and you have given me the greatest gift of all. You have listened to me. With that, I'll hand back to our hosts for any Q&A.